Hi, this is Dr. Dan Plews, applied sports scientist and Ironman triathlete, and this is the Physical Performance Show.
And the winner is...
Failure is not an option.
I've had my ups and my downs.
I think it's an absolutely breakthrough experience.
Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, the show designed to inspire the pursuit of your physical best performance. I'm your host, Brad Beer. Listen in as we delve into how the world's top physical performers achieve their success, as well as the highs, the lows, and the journey of getting there. Let's get ready, set, let's go. Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, brought to you by our patrons and the Physical Performance Show's Learnings membership, where you can support the production of the show and in return receive free access to our entire catalogue of live stream events and experts. I'm Brad Beer, sports physiotherapist by trade and training and founder of Pogo Physio. Each week we'll bring you the latest and greatest information and inspiration designed to help you perform at your physical best. And of course, we do this across a range of different episodes, featured performers, coaches' corners, interest editions, and the all-popular expert editions. And this week, episode 256, we jump back over with an expert edition, and you'll hear from return guest, highly popular guest, Dr. Dan Plews. We've themed this episode high-intensity interval training for endurance athletes. Now, if you missed Dan Plews back on episode 213, it was one of 2020's top 10 most downloaded expert editions, where Dr. Dan shared around heat acclimation and adaptation for endurance athletes. And when you look at Dr. Dan's bio, you'll understand why he was such a great guest to invite onto the show for an exploration of that topic. You see, Dr. Dan Plews is the Hawaii Ironman Triathlon age group world record holder with a blistering 8:24 set in 2018. That's 8 hours and 24 minutes. By way of bio, alongside Dan's own athletic achievements, he has a PhD in exercise physiology, which looked at heart rate variability to assess training adaptation. He's coached 3 professional Ironman triathletes to sub 8 hours, including Terenzo Boyzone, Jan van Berkel, and Tim van Berkel. Dr. Plews has consulted with New Zealand Rowing and currently serves a role of high performance manager for Team Emirates New Zealand in the America's Cup. And of course, Dan is the founder of EndureIQ, a fantastic online endurance coaching community and service. And on today's episode, you'll hear Dr. Dan Plews share around what high-intensity interval training actually is, the different types of high-intensity interval training, the physiological benefits, how to build HIIT training into your program and work it around an overall periodized plan, how to manipulate the variables of high-intensity interval training, the role of recovery between work bouts, and Dan shares some of his favourite HIIT sessions across swim, bike, and run. There's so many learnings in this exploration of such an important topic, so be sure to have your pen and paper ready, or at least the repeat button ready. Oh, and keep an ear out for Dr. Dan Plews' physical challenge for the week. Here is my conversation with Dr. Dan Plews, exercise physiologist, high performance manager, EndureIQ founder, on all things high-intensity interval training for the endurance athlete. Dr. Dan Plews, welcome back to the Physical Performance Show.
Yeah, good to be back, Brad. Thanks for inviting me back.
Well, it was episode 213, Heat Training and Acclimation for the Endurance Athlete, where you last featured, and that episode's been extremely popular, making the top 10 countdown for the expert editions for 2020. And I know you quipped that you were surprised it didn't make the top 3. I think it might have been the time it was released.
Yeah, that's all good. There were some pretty heavy hitters in front of me, so you know, I guess I can take it. I was only jesting, but no, it was seems like a long time ago now, and there's been a lot happened between that last episode and now. I guess I think that was at the start of the year, 2020.
Yeah, it would have been. I think before, relatively all hell broke loose with COVID, so it was kind of a normal world. And on that, Dan, to bring us up to speed, our topic for today is a deep dive into this area of HIIT training or high intensity training for endurance athletes. What has your world looked like over the last year or so, like professionally, and also your own racing?
Yeah, well, I mean, I snooker racing, but I'll talk about my own racing. I snooker racing in March. I did a Taupo 70.3. I think that was pretty much the last race that happened in 2020. So I sneaked that in, and then that was that in terms of racing. But then actually I got into a bit of mountain biking. So I really enjoyed taking on that challenge. I did a 100-kilometer mountain bike race. So that was kind of my focus over the winter of New Zealand, at least. And I really enjoyed that. But professionally, I have to say, I count my lucky stars, and I'm very grateful that I've been less impacted than a lot of other people. So, I mean, obviously the business side of things, people aren't racing, people with EndureIQ, people aren't as interested in like doing courses about their performance. And we had a lot of, it was very popular at the start of lockdown, but then it kind of, people realized that, okay, racing actually isn't happening, and it became less popular. And of course, people don't really want coaching at the same time. But then, with my other jobs, America's Cup, Emirates Team New Zealand, women's kayak, with the Olympics, those are contract based and they still ticked along. So I was, pretty fortunate in that regard. So just obviously a little bit of an impact, but yeah, I think pretty grateful. It could have been a lot worse, that's for sure.
And as we speak and record, you are waiting to see, with your role with Emirates Team New Zealand for the America's Cup, I believe you're waiting to see who will emerge victorious and take on New Zealand in the, I don't know, do you call it the final?
Yeah, well, it is the final. Yep, exactly. So, so Brad, you are actually making me miss it, but that's okay. Well, that's okay. I can watch it on YouTube later. But yeah, so at the moment it's the Americans versus the, so there's 4 boats in total. So there's a New Zealand boat, which is the team that I'm obviously working with. American boat, it's an Italian boat, and a British boat. The British boat is already straight through to the final. So now it's between the Americans and the Italians to see who go. Sorry, this is the final of the Prada Cup. So then it's and the winner of the Prada Cup faces New Zealand, and now Italy and America are facing off in a match race to see who will go against the British in the final, and the winner of that will then face Team New Zealand in the America's Cup.
And your role there with Emirates Team New Zealand is as an exercise physiologist, correct?
Well, my official title is Head of Physical Performance. So I oversee all the physical performance side of things. So the coaching, the strength and conditioning, the physiotherapy, the health and well-being. Yeah, so that's my role. But I think, on a day-to-day basis, obviously I have such great people who work with me. Like the physio is amazing. He's much more experienced in the America's Cup than I have been. Strength and conditioner is amazing. So we kind of take on our own roles, and it's quite and I don't really have to do too much in that regard. And my main responsibility is very coachy. So I take control of the program, the training program, pretty much making sure that the grinders are fit and able to do the tasks that they need to perform on the boat, really.
And the grinding, we've featured Kai Hurst prior as a featured performer of the show, and I think Kai gave a good outline of the arduous required. I don't think many people realise the physicality of it. Anything you'd add to that, Dan?
Yeah, I mean, well, the best way that I can describe it is it's very similar to any cyclist or anyone who's ridden a bike competitively may have done a cycling criterium. I mean, the racing itself is very much like doing a cycling criterium in that it's got really short, sharp, intense efforts out of corners, which will be like doing a maneuver. And then, the bits in between on the straights, it's not so hard, because what they're doing is they're topping up the accumulator to make maneuvers and make changes in the sails and make differences to do different things on the boat. So that's the main thing that they're doing. So obviously the more so Pete Burling and Pete Burling, who's a skipper, the more he is having to do in terms of change the sail and more decisions he has to make, the harder it is for the grinders. So in conditions that are really, really windy or not very windy, really hard on the grinders, but those moderate conditions, not so much. And it's because in those conditions, they're having to, gust and change of winds and falling off the foils and coming back up again. There's a lot of work for them to do. So can be quite hard. You're talking there well above, the races are 20 to 25 minutes and they'll be at a heart rate higher than their threshold heart rate for much of that. And, 5 to 10 beats below their maximal heart rate. So it's pretty tough.
Very intense. And no doubt the topic for today's expert edition features heavily in their training, high-intensity interval training.
Yep, we definitely do a bit of that for sure.
Dan, let's explore the topic. So HIIT, high-intensity interval training for endurance athletes. Maybe we start with a definition. What is it? I think most athletes, recreationally competitive, or certainly elite, are familiar with the term, but can you layer a definition around it?
Yeah, so high-intensity interval training is basically defined as repeated bouts of exercise above the what would be deemed as an anaerobic threshold, maximal lactate steady state, or critical power. Deem it as all those different terms as you want, which is interspersed with periods of recovery, and that is by definition what high-intensity interval training is. And I think the main mistake that many people make in this regard is, it's not just simply split up exercise. So you can say you're doing high-intensity interval training. It has to be above critical power to be classified as a high-intensity interval.
And so that definition again, repeated bouts of exercise above the anaerobic threshold interspersed with periods of recovery.
Exactly, yep.
You said the critical part there is it has to be above the anaerobic threshold. So if an athlete is doing interval type work, it still might not be high intensity training because it's not above that threshold, correct?
Yeah, exactly. So I guess that's the difference between interval training and high intensity interval training. Like, just, you could say you're doing intervals, but if they're kind of like, below that anaerobic threshold, they're not high intensity intervals. And that's the main difference. And those, but the intervals can be split into different types of intervals, which I'm sure we can get into with a bit more detail if you'd like.
Yeah, if possible, let's explore the different types, Dan.
Yeah, so I think I'll have to say from the start that so when I think we got in touch over this topic because you were aware that I published or was an author in the book High Intensity Interval Training, which was with Martin Bichette and Professor Paul Lawson. So that those two are definitely the leaders and experts in the world in that field. But I was I contributed to the rowing part and the triathlon part. So, but in their book, they basically classify their intervals into 5 different types. So they have their repeated sprint training, so RST, and repeated sprint training is generally classified where you're doing work periods of between 3 to 10 seconds with recovery periods of between 15 and 60 seconds. And then we also have what's called sprint interval training, or SIT, as most people will often be referred to as, often people refer to this as SIT. And that's where you're looking at really high intensity, which between 20 and 30 seconds. And then the recovery is between 1 minute to 4 minutes of recovery. And then we also have short intervals. So the short intervals are between 10 and 60 seconds, but the difference between the short intervals and the sit intervals is the recovery is a lot less. So you're talking like 30 on, 30 off, 40 on, 20 off. And then finally we have finally of the actual intervals, we have long intervals, and that's the duration of those intervals is generally between 2 to 5 minutes, and the recovery is between 1 and 4 minutes. And the reason I said there's 5, but I don't think it really concerns us, is that the 5th one that they, Martin and Paul also talk about in high intensity interval training programming puzzle book is game-based interval training, where you set up a game in football or rugby and you try and get some kind of intervals based on actual scenarios. But I don't think we're that. I've never done that. I don't know whether you have, Brad. maybe some Aussie rules back in the day.
I never played football. I was worried I might get injured for a triathlon, Dan.
Yeah, well, and I'm exactly the same. So
very singly focused, and probably a good move too. And so those 5 types again, Dan, predominantly 4 types, excluding the game-based interval training: repeated sprint training, sprint interval training, short intervals, and long intervals. And as you outlined there, they are differentiated
by their work period and their recovery period, but they're all high.
Yeah, exactly. And I think more recently, those long intervals have been kind of separated again. So there's been a few studies that have come out more recently. I think it's by Rosenbach, who suggested that you can actually split those into like moderate long and long. And moderate long being 2 to 4 minutes, and then long being 4 and above, and 4 to 8, I guess, is the kind of maximal you kind of look at when you're doing high intensity intervals. I mean, some people say that you can do intervals of 20 minutes for high intensity intervals, but you're not, the ability to then go very far above your critical power is you can't go that far above over 20 minutes. And I think one thing I should mention when we talk about high intensity interval training is that the anaerobic threshold of what, or call it what you will, it's the difference between what we call a heavy exercise domain and then a severe exercise domain, and it's really the boundary between the two. And it's this kind of term that's called anaerobic threshold, and people, it deems that it's the point at which we go anaerobic, but it's not really the case. I like to define it as it's when you're exceeding the capacity of the mitochondria to produce ATP. So you're having to use an additional energy source, which would be some kind of, anaerobic contribution to achieve that power output. Because if at the threshold, at least, you are in a quasi steady state. So we typically see some quasi steady state values in terms of some of the physiological variables such as VO2, hydrogen ions, and lactate. They're all in a quasi steady state. But once we go above that, we're no longer in any steady state, and we'll see pretty big increases in that time, which is why once you get over it, once you go over that threshold, typically over time, you will achieve your VO2 max ventilation.
Once you're in that severe domain.
You're in that severe exercise domain. Exactly. Yeah. And it takes around 2 minutes to get there generally, but depending on how far above it you are.
Yeah, so it takes about 2 minutes before you hit before you hit VO2 max, Dan, above the threshold. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I think, just athletically, anyone that does train, which would be most people tuning in, can easily delineate that difference in sensation or perception of effort from heavy to severe.
Yeah, and you can hear it as well, because there's so many terms in physiology for this. Another one is respiratory compensation point, and you can hear, if you're ever riding with your mates, right? And Paul Lawson, who was the author of Hit Science, me and him, when he lived in New Zealand, we used to always go a bit of riding together, and we'd always go up a hill, and I'd always go back and go, oh, past your respiratory compensation point, because I could just hear this sudden change in breath, and the breathing becomes much more labored, and it's a real break point.
Only the exercise scientists, physiologists, sports scientists would geek out on that while they're training, right?
Yeah, it's definitely a sports science, a physiologist joke, right?
Dan, okay, so we've identified the different types. Before we maybe loop back and explore where those fit in a training program or periodizing someone's approach to their season, let's explore the physiological benefits. How does an athlete benefit from high intensity interval training, irrespective of the type?
Yeah, so I guess when it comes to high intensity interval training, obviously first and foremost, it's part of a balanced program. I think that's the most important thing. I know you've had Stephen Seeler on here talking about the polarized training, but this is the perfect example of where high intense interval training would fit in that 20%, right? That's where that goes, and the rest of it is that 80% low intensity. Typically, what you see is what's believed with high intensity interval training, and this comes out of some of the work from Dave Bishop's lab over in Melbourne, is that it's believed that the main adaptations from high intensity interval training are more central. So from the heart, cardiac output. But of course, there still are a lot of peripheral adaptations that are going on as well. But the main ones are thought to be more central. So you can think about some things with like increased cardiac output, and then in the peripherally, you can be looking at specifically things like something called MCT, which is monocarboxylate transporters in the muscle, which help shuttle lactate around for energy and things like that. They're really heightened when you're doing that high intensity interval training. But what's quite interesting in this area, Brad, is, some research has been done, because there's always a question between, okay, what type of interval training is the best? And there's been some research that's been done in comparing specifically short interval training with more of the long typical intervals. So when you're talking short, like 30 seconds maximal with 3 minutes recovery compared to like, 3 minutes on, 3 minutes off, that kind of longer based interval. And what the results typically show is that VO2 max is improved in both scenarios. So we see, if you're measuring that in the lab, when we see VO2 max, for example, sprint interval training, you'll get some good increases in VO2 max, sometimes better than you would see with the long intervals. But the difference comes in performance, and typically when it comes to time trial performance, and particularly something that's measured like maximal aerobic power, for example, you see more benefits from doing the longer type intervals. So when it comes to performance, of course, the maximal aerobic power is more of a prerequisite of doing well in a race. But they're two interesting factors that I think you really want to pull apart as a coach or a practitioner, because it then allows you to kind of know when you can target different things within your training program.
And just to recap there, Dan, what I feel like I heard is the longer may be more beneficial than the shorter. Is that just in certain situations?
Yeah, it depends. So for specific performance outcomes, like if you're doing a time trial performance, yes. But if you were just looking at increasing your VO2 max, for example, as a physiological variable, then no. They're pretty much the same, and in some situations the short interval training is slightly better. And that's also interesting because that's considering the total work of a short interval or a sit, as I'll keep calling it, is a lot less generally than a long interval, because you can get good adaptations. Some studies have shown that even 4 by 30 seconds, absolutely maximal, with say 3 to 4 minutes recovery, can get some great gains and adaptations in specifically your VO2 max, but not necessarily in your time trial performance.
Yeah, which I guess in some ways intuitively makes sense. In some ways, maybe not. I'm just thinking back to the old 30-second Wingate test.
Well, it's very similar to that for sure. But what's typically happening then is that you've got, on the short interval training side, you're definitely working the maximal capacity, oxygen uptake and heightened your physiology. But on the other side, you're having to work some efficiency and economy, and you're spending more time at a higher VO2 max as well. A higher VO2. So more time at VO2 max. So that's probably where you're getting some of the benefits, because then suddenly you're having to really focus on being efficient at a high VO2, whereas it's not really so much the case when it comes to the short interval training. And I think my feeling is, even though it's not being shown, is that, short intervals would be more towards that as well, would be more towards the short interval training, whereas the long intervals are definitely more towards the performance side. So, and that's the approach that I typically take when I'm coaching, and the athletes that I work with is early in the year, even in kind of the early general, like what you want to call the general phase of training, we'll always start off with short intervals. And then as the competition gets closer, we'll move into more of those longer intervals, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes, even 8-minute intervals, because it's more specific as well. And always the principle of specificity is important when it comes to any kind of training, right?
Which that would be intuitive, for a long course triathlete, that they'd be looking for that time trial improvement or performance gain. So hence the longer intervals being prescribed closer to the performance, right?
Exactly. Yeah. But I think it almost goes through with any triathlon distance. If you're doing the longer distance triathlons, I'm not sure you'd need to be doing some of those longer VO2 sessions too close to your race, because you could be focusing on more like very specific intensities. But if you're doing an Olympic distance or sprint distance, I think you definitely still want to be doing a reasonable degree of the long intervals close to your race. That's for sure.
And Dr. Dan, the physiological benefits, obviously the cardiovascular, the central stuff, I think many people have a good sort of intuitive feel around changes there. But what are some of those potential peripheral adaptations that can happen?
Yeah, so some of the peripheral adaptations, obviously one of these like MCT and some of the enzymes that help with energy uptake and energy creation, so to speak. But also some of the normal ones, like mitochondrial biogenesis, for example, and increased capillarization. Just going back to what I talked about before with the short interval training versus the long interval training, there was a study that was done, I can't remember the author now, but they specifically looked at mitochondrial biogenesis, looking at some of the cellular markers versus long intervals versus the short intervals. And they showed that mitochondrial biogenesis with some of those markers of molecular activation was higher after doing short interval training, but it still didn't, that which then goes into showing why VO2 max was improved, but it still didn't necessarily improve performance. So there's two sides to the coin. I think you can work your physiology on one side and then work your performance and be more specific on the other, which then goes back into why it does make sense to start with shorter sit and short intervals, and then move into your longer intervals as you get closer to racing for most endurance athletes.
Yeah, that's brilliant. So there's two sides of the benefit coin, if you like. There's the central and the peripheral. I think everyone recognises that this has a place in their training program somewhere, but the obvious question is, how do you build it in? And I'm assuming you've got to start with the end goal in mind and reverse engineer.
Yeah, I mean, there's the ways that you think about interval training is the intent of what you're training for and the intensity of what you're doing, but mostly it's total work. So most interval training, the total work will be somewhere as low as like 8 minutes and can be as high as 30, even 32 minutes. That's what basically makes intervals harder. I mean, you can change the work to rest ratios, but bottom line is doing 30 minutes of total work above your critical power is a lot harder than doing 10 minutes of total work above your critical power, for example. You want to build up to doing more total work within your main set of your intervals. So for example, 8 by 4 minutes would be 32 minutes of total work. So that is a very classic high intensity interval training session that's been shown to be very effective for improvements in performance. So that's the way you need to think of it, is where do you want to get to, and start with, you can start with low total work. You can leave the total work the same, change the work to rest ratios a little bit. Make the work ratio longer, make the recovery a bit shorter. And then that's one way you can manipulate it. And then you can also build up the total work on top of that as well.
So so manipulating the total work duration, and then obviously also manipulating plus or minus the recovery period. And I mean, something like the 4 by 8 minutes or 8 by 4 minutes, would the only consideration there be, I mean, there's probably plenty of considerations, Dan, but is it what time of the season it is that you're prescribing that? Are they building up so you'd probably be doing the 8 minutes later in the season as opposed to the 4 minute efforts? Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think specifically if you're talking triathlon and those sorts of sports, I think that's probably more the way. In the book, a high intensity interval training book, one of the things that Martin and Paul always taught me, by the way, they were also my PhD supervisors, so they definitely taught me a lot, is, it's context before content. So what is the context of what you're trying to achieve with your athlete? What does the event look like? What does your athlete need to be better at? And then it's a case of manipulating the intervals to what you're trying to achieve. When it comes to intervals, there's pretty much 3 areas that you can play with. So you can look at the neuromuscular component, you can look at the anaerobic contribution, and then you can look at the aerobic contribution. And the manipulation of how much you want to dive into those is very dependent on that work to rest ratio. So typically as the duration of the rep is getting shorter and the recovery of the rep is getting longer, it's shifting more towards an anaerobic component and then even to a neuromuscular component. So something like 5 seconds on with 60 seconds off would be highly neuromuscular. But then you go with like 30 seconds on, 20 seconds on, and 3 minutes off, you're going more anaerobic. But then if you're going more towards 4 minutes on and 1 minute off, you're then becoming more aerobic. But it's not like one's on and one's off. You have to think of those three things as like dimmer switches. So if you imagine a room with 3 lights in, you're never turning one off. You're just making one shine more brightly than the other, depending on how much you are manipulating or changing those little manipulations within a interval.
So there's the 3 components there: the neuromuscular, the anaerobic, and the aerobic contribution. You said it's not a matter of turning them completely off; it's just a matter of turning them down or shining one up. And if this sounds a little bit overwhelming for, say, the athlete that wants to start including some high-intensity interval training, Dan, but maybe doesn't have a coach alongside them yet or access to a coach, is there any sort of starting points that they could safely navigate, or is it just too broad a question, Dan, because once again it's contextualized by the individual?
Yeah, well, I think let's focus on what we think about for endurance sports. Like I said, the best starting point is that total work. So, a real safe and easy place to start would be, like looking at 8 minutes of total work. And I think for most endurance sports, you definitely want to keep the intervals above 30 seconds. And then really you can just start by playing with like a 1-for-1 work to rest ratio and see how you fare with that. So say you wanted 8 minutes, you could do 16 by 30 on, 30 off, which would give you 8 minutes of total work. And then you can start manipulating and playing from there. So then, maybe the next step might be 16 by 40 on, 20 off. So you've just increased the work ratio, decreased the recovery a little bit, and it's got that a little bit harder. But I think, the biggest, there's a few mistakes that people make, but I think a big mistake that people can make is they try and change too many things at once. So they'll change the total work, they'll change the duration of the interval, and then they'll reduce the recovery, and it's just too big a jump. So you just, like with any good experiment, just change one variable at a time. You either increase the total work and leave the reps the same. So you could go from 16 by 30 on to 30 off to 18, or you can change that work to rest ratio and make that a little bit harder, but do the same total work. And I think by following those basic principles and guidelines, that's a pretty safe place to start. With getting, and then basically you build up that intent, you build up the total work over time. I think, it's really hard. 25 minutes is hard. If you're going like 32 minutes is very hard, but again, you have to reduce that intensity a little bit. So, you could typically you might be able to do 105% of your threshold power for maybe 25 minutes, but that becomes quite hard to do. You might have to go to 103% of your threshold power for 8 by 4 minutes or 32 minutes of total work.
So just be wary of not trying to manipulate too many of those variables at once, which is good common sense with most things in life, I think.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, exactly.
And Dan, in terms of, I guess we're jumping ahead here a little, we can come back, but tapering, we've just featured Inigo Mujica around advice for endurance athletes with tapering. From his literature reviews and scientific body of work, one of the key takeaways was to keep the intensity in for the athlete going into a taper, manipulate the volume, perhaps the frequency, but definitely keep the intensity high. So is there any advice for athletes heading into a taper with regards to do with their high intensity?
Yeah, so I think Indigo did one of the best meta-analyses on tapering, and I think the conclusion was you keep the intensity high and you keep the frequency of training similar as well. So where frequency is number of training sessions that you're doing a week, but the main thing is that you're reducing the overall volume. And I believe that, around a 50% reduction, depending on what type of taper you're doing, but my understanding from his meta-analysis that whether it was a linear taper or a step taper, it didn't really make too much difference. The main thing was that the intensity was the same, the frequency was the same, and the volume was reduced. So say you've been doing a typical high intensity interval session that's been, say, every week you've been doing, say, let's just say 5 by 3 minutes. In that taper period, you just pretty much split it in half. The total work to split that in half. So if that was like 15 minutes, you could say, okay, I'm going to do 7.5 minutes of total work. And you could also make it a little bit easier by changing the duration of those reps as well if you wanted. But I think split the total work in half and then keep the intensity very similar. The issue is that when you generally reduce the work of an interval, people will generally bring up the intensity as well. So it sometimes is good in a taper to keep the duration of each rep the same as to what you've been doing in the build-up, because at least then you kind of can gauge it and keep it in the same level, because you don't want to be going in a taper harder, right? You want to make it easier. So, people can say, oh, less intervals, and I've been doing these at 300 watts, and now this week I'm going to do them at 340 watts because I've got less intervals. So you kind of want to keep that the same.
Yeah, which that makes sense. So the takeaway there, Dan, would be keep the intensity up. Definitely don't over-index on intensity just because you're reducing the total work.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Otherwise, you could come unstuck. You'd be tired come race day.
Dan, I guess let's use the example of a triathlete. How do they think about integrating HIIT sessions into their 3 disciplines that they're training for in a week or a mesocycle?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky one when you're dealing with 3 disciplines, right? So like working with age group athletes specifically, I definitely will never give high intensity intervals in swimming for specifically age group athletes, because generally I just find that they don't have the technical capabilities often when they're not from a swimming background to really get the most out of doing high intensity interval training in the pool. So I'll never do it. But with elites and swimming backgrounds, I tend to find that that's absolutely fine. And I also find it doesn't really take too much out of them. So I almost consider that as a session. Like if I was going to do 3, I could almost do 3 high intensity interval sessions with an elite if one of them is swimming. But for most athletes, I think you don't really want to do more than one is okay, but you don't really want to do more than 2 per week from over a 7-day cycle. I think if you go into much more than that, you're really pushing the envelope a little bit too much.
Is that, just to clarify, Dan, is that 2 per discipline or 2 total?
2 total.
Yeah, 2 total.
2 total, yeah.
Yeah. And used swimming as an example there. What might be an example of a HIIT session you might prescribe for one of your elite triathletes? I mean, you've coached some of the planet's best long course triathlon talent.
In swimming or?
Yeah, in swimming.
In swimming, yeah. I mean, a classic swimming one would be like 5 200s, for example. Because that's a classic long session. So you could go 5 200s with 2 to 3 minutes recovery, best pace, and that's that's a real classic one. 1,000 meters in total. I mean, you can do more. I mean, you can definitely do more than that. You could even do 10. That would be one that's quite moderate coming into a race is a bit of a final builder. One of my I do enjoy 10 by 3 minutes cycling with 2 minutes recovery. That's quite a good classic one that I give a lot. And then of course, even something like 8 by 1K on the track, that's quite a classic, with 200 recovery, that is a very classic long interval. So
classic and painful.
Classic and painful, yeah, for sure. And I mean, I think nearly so many runners do 8 by 1K with 2 minutes recovery, right? It's such a classic session.
Or classically painful.
Yeah.
You're listening to Dr. Dan Plews on this expert edition on all things high-intensity interval training for the endurance athlete. Support for today's show comes from the Physical Performance Show's Learnings membership, where we've made it possible to support the show for just $5 per month and in return, we'll grant you access to our back catalogue and all forthcoming live stream events featuring world-acclaimed experts on all things physical performance. In 2020, we hosted Dr. Stephen Seiler for his live stream event, Sustainable Training for Attainable Endurance Goals, and also Dr. Shona Halson, Recovery Essentials for Optimal Performance, both of which were so very popular. And in 2021, we have some wonderful live stream guests planned for you. So to support the show, it's simple. Jump over to Patreon, Patreon, and search for the Physical Performance Show. And there, from just $5 per month, you can support the production of the show. There's no obligation or expectation, but we really do appreciate our show patrons. Support for today's show also comes from Pogo Physio's online telehealth consultations. If you are an endurance athlete frustrated with bone, joint, or tendon-related concerns, then our 45-minute online telehealth consultations can help you get back to your physical best. Join athletes from around the world and interstate outside of Queensland, Australia, connecting with myself and the Pogo Physio team to get back to their physical best and across their physio finish line. To schedule your 45-minute online telehealth consultation, jump over to pogophysio.com.au/telehealth. Or if you have an injury question and you'd simply like some guidance, then you are most welcome to drop me an email, b.beer@pogophysio.com.au. For now, let's jump back with this week's featured guest on this expert edition, high-intensity interval training for endurance athletes, Dr. Dan Plews.
Dan, a question just for my own interest. I understand the work component, but what's being manipulated with the rest period? So obviously you can change the work period, but what's the goal in changing that? Is it because it doesn't always have to stay like a work to rest 1-to-1 ratio, correct?
Correct. No, it definitely doesn't. No. So it's basically twofold. So on one side, you can manipulate that recovery to keep your VO2 elevated, right? So if you imagine that with VO2 max efforts, you're trying to achieve, you want to be around 90% of your VO2 max for as long as you possibly can. So if you do an interval and you take a lot of recovery, your VO2 kinetics, your VO2 will come down. And then if it goes a long way down, it takes a while for it to come back up again. So, each time you start an interval, the first period of that will be not, a very high VO2. But if you say you went from a 3-minute recovery to a 1-minute recovery, your VO2 does not have the time to come back down. So the next interval, therefore, you will spend more time at a higher VO2, which can be a good thing. Of course, right? But on the downside of that, you typically see reduced work output, so the power will be lower. And this is because of something called, what's very popular in the literature, is W prime, which is basically your anaerobic capacity. So with those, so when you're designing intervals, you can, and people have even tried to mathematically model this now, you can understand the reconstruction of W prime in the recovery. So when is someone's W prime fully restored so they can then do another interval, for example. And if you wanted to deplete someone completely of W prime over a very short period, you wouldn't allow them to recover between. So it depends on what you're trying to achieve. But that's why, most intervals are around that 1-to-1. Because we typically, actually that's not true. Most intervals aren't between 1-to-1. Most intervals of the long duration are, we typically see 2 to 3 minutes of recovery, because that allows for not too much of a drop in VO2, but also for a good next interval as well. So
because you're trying to optimize or maximize the amount of time above VO2 above VO2 and near VO2 max.
Yeah, exactly. And you want to achieve high power outputs as well, right? So, if anyone, I can give a good challenge is that I often give this session that's with my athletes it's a threshold session, right? And it's basically it's 4 sets of 4 by 2 minutes with 30 seconds recovery. So you have to do it at your threshold power. And because that recovery is so short, it gives you almost no time to reconstruct your W prime, your anaerobic capacity. So if you go out too hard and you're way above your threshold and you don't have that quasi steady state, that physiological steady state, you won't finish the set because you'll just be bombing. You can't maintain it because you're too much you're depleting your W prime, you're depleting your anaerobic capacity, and you're not allowing yourself to replenish. So that's a prime example of how that interaction works. And just to finish off on the recovery, I know Stephen Sealer, who's been on your show, like he's shown that, when it comes to recovery, we typically don't really see much difference when it gets over 2 minutes. So, once you're over 2 minutes, it's not really making that much difference to how the next interval will come out and the power that the athlete can do. But anything under 2 minutes makes quite big differences. So, the difference between 30 seconds and a minute, that's quite a lot. The difference between a minute and 90 seconds, that's quite a lot. But once you get over 2 minutes, we're starting to see less differences in the ability to repeat those exercise bouts with high intensity interval training.
And what's the mechanism for that, Dan?
Well, that's just what I've talked about. It's the reconstruction of the W prime and the anaerobic capacity, really. I mean, there was a paper that was published by Chien in MSSE in 2019, and he went through some of the repletion of the W prime. And one of the things there's many things that affect it. One is obviously how fit you are. Another is how hard you've gone, right? So if you've gone at if you've done 30 seconds at 105% of your threshold power versus, 115%, your depletion is much more. So you're going to, over that interval is much more. So you're going to need more time to recover that. But also it was found that a fast depletion in W prime generally repletes faster as well. So to make that more simply, if you imagine that you do a very fast burn of a match, it will reignite much quicker rather than a slow burn of a match. It seems to take a little bit longer for it to reconstruct. So that's also something that you need to consider. So like if you had a depletion of 10% over 5 minutes versus 10% over 30 seconds, what this study showed was that the repletion over the 30 seconds is a bit quicker. So it's all really like there's so many interplay and factors that come into this, and people are trying to actually model it on mathematically as well. So.
Gosh, hence why we need scientists like yourself and academics to then translate it to the athletic world for incorporating. Dan, I recall Dr. Stephen Seiler using the adage with high intensity interval training to not fly and die, to try and maintain power rather than basically going out of the gate, burning all the matches. Is that something that helps athletes get the most out of their high intensity interval training, or is there times when you do want them to absolutely burn the matches quickly?
Well, it's funny because I can't remember the name of the author, but there was a recent study that was done that actually looked at it was 3 minute intervals, and basically the difference was either the person held a steady state power or they went out really hard for the first minute and then held a lower power. And the effect was that the intervals where they went out that little bit harder had a better impact on their performance. And, the reason, so that's over the course of one interval, but it was still maintained all the way through. So there is some merit in perhaps breaking up your intervals a little bit. So if you're doing like 3 minutes and you're averaging 300 watts for that 3 minutes, you could either say you're going to go out and just do it all at 300 watts, or you're going to do the first minute at 400 watts, and then you're going to go and do the second 2 minutes at to average 300 would be like 270 or something like that. There's some merit in doing that. And the reason being because you're elevating your VO2 very quickly, and then you're sustaining a higher VO2 for the duration of the interval. But that's over the course of one rep. But if you were to just go out really, really hard on the first rep, on the second rep, on the third rep, and then, your aim was to hold a certain power, and you do the last reps really badly, you're so tired, your VO2 is probably not as high as it was. Generally, we can see reductions in heart rate as well. So it's 100% right. You should not go out and fly and die. And also, I think, you as a physio, like you don't want to be going out, losing all your form, really poor mechanics, specifically in running, and doing 8 1Ks, doing the first 3 really well with good form, and then doing the last 5 looking really bad because the injury risk is high, right? So I think as a coach and anyone who's helping athletes, I think it's not really that great advice.
So just don't fly and die. It holds true. And plus, if an athlete's putting in the effort, of course, they always want to maximize the gain. So there's more to be gained by trying to, not fly and die.
And I think, the ultimate, it's fine to go out a bit harder in your last one and do better power. But I think, if you really get an interval right, and if you really get the intervals right, you should, the last one should be like a 10 out of 10 effort, but you've held the same power all the way through. So, typically we might see the first one feeling like a 7 out of 10 and an 8 out of 10, 8 out of 10, and then as you get towards the end, it's absolutely full effort to actually get through the interval. And that's if you can achieve that, you've done a great job of the interval.
Wow, that's really powerful, Dan. If you can get to that last rep with a 10 out of 10 effort or perception of effort, but it's the same power, then you've really nailed it.
You've really nailed it, yeah.
Yeah. Wow. And on that, I'm just curious, as an incredible endurance athlete, Dan, yourself, are there any psychological mantras that you use when you're doing your HIIT training? I know Ryan Hall, American US record holder, marathon record holder, I read recently on one of his posts that he tells himself that every rep is just the first rep.
Yeah. I really think there's something to that, is that I think about that one rep at that time and never think about the fact that I've got to do, and I tell this to all the athletes and America's Cup guys who we do some pretty high intensity intervals. I'm like, if you start thinking about the reps in front, you're already kind of losing the battle. You just think about one at a time every time. I typically do my intervals inside as well. So, I think clock watching can be, really bad. So I'll try not to look at the time, and sometimes if I'm cycling, I'll actually just count my cadence. So knowing that I'm doing like 90, so say I'm doing like 3-minute intervals, I'll count up to 93 times and then look at the clock, sort of thing, just try.
That's a good practical tip for surviving the suffering, Dan.
Yeah. They're pretty, they're not that pleasant, right? Those, and that's why I think, what we talked about earlier is, those doing the shorter intervals earlier, I feel that they're just a little bit easier on the mind, 30 on, 30 off, 40 on, 20 off. You're always kind of, shifting, but doing those long intervals is hard, and I think you want to save those for later in the season when it really counts, and don't do them too early because they can be a real mental challenge, that's for sure.
And on that, Dan, how far apart, it's obviously you can manipulate this for different reasons, I suspect, with the prescription of a program, but in general terms, would you want to see them split apart X amount of days recovery wise, or it varies? Yeah,
for sure. That's an awesome question. So when it comes to typically what we classify as any exercise that's in that VO2 max domain above like that critical power, you definitely want to leave 48 hours between the two for sure. So, you could do some easy aerobic exercise in between, but I would say a minimum of 48 hours is generally what most people can seem to get away with. And that was Jamie Stanley, who did his PhD in Hawaii variability, kind of looked at this a little bit as well. He did a bit of a review in Journal of Sports Medicine. And the suggestion that was from all of the literature that he looked at, specifically looking at Hawaii variability and recovery time course, was that low intensity training, so anything below the aerobic threshold, is less than 24 hours to recover. So you could pretty much do back-to-back endurance sessions, one in the morning, one in the afternoon. Threshold based, like tempo to threshold, so anywhere between that kind of aerobic to the anaerobic threshold, that sort of domain is around is around 24 to 48 hours. And then the high intensity VO2 max HIIT sessions more than 48 hours. So so that's kind of the best practice you can put together when you're manipulating training programs.
So that's what you can work off.
Yeah, exactly. It's pretty. I mean, I think with those rules, it's really important. You can really start to understand how you can then build your training programs.
You're listening to repeat guest Dr. Dan Plews on this expert edition exploring all things high-intensity interval training for endurance athletes. If you missed last week's episode, it was a Coach's Corner featuring another New Zealand guest, and that is Craig Kirkwood, high-performance New Zealand athletics and triathlon coach of prior featured guest of the show, featured performer Hayden Wild, triathlon sensation, and Craig shared from his own athletic accomplishments and his many years in coaching triathletes and runners to date. It's been such a well-received episode, and here's a little snippet of my conversation with Craig.
We have the CK Hilly Loop of Death, which is a 3.5K circuit, has 3 climbs of varying lengths and steepnesses. So we do laps of that, whether it be, hard laps, or we break it up and just run the climbs hard and jog between them, or sometimes we do them as a progression, so each lap gets a little bit faster. So we throw those at athletes as well, mainly in kind of what you would traditionally call a base type phase, where we're looking for strength.
To enjoy the full learnings from Craig Kirkwood on episode 255, be sure to jump back and download the show from wherever it is you enjoy the Physical Performance Show from. We're also now available on YouTube and, of course, across all of the podcast platforms. For now, let's jump back with this week's featured guest, Dan Plews, PhD, on all things high-intensity interval training for the endurance athlete.
Dan, any advice for the aging athlete? Any nuances for the masters athlete around high-intensity interval training? Obviously, there's physiological changes centrally every decade that unfortunately every masters athlete needs to reconcile.
Yeah, well, I know that Joe Friel's book, he is a big advocate of, as you get older, doing a little bit more high intensity interval training, keeping those pieces of the physiology alive, right? And I really think that, you use it or lose it. So I don't think people should, the aging athletes should avoid doing high intensity interval training. I don't think it's not impossible. To go too hard is quite hard to go too hard, but to do it frequently is quite easy to do. So I think the main thing for the aging athlete would be, think about the total work that you're doing, and don't go crazy like doing the higher end. So you can probably cap it around 15 minutes of total work, and then also, one or maximum of 2 a week, but making sure that they're nicely spread out in your week. So, book, as much recovery between the two as you possibly can get.
Yeah, keeping parts of the physiology alive. That's great.
Yeah, exactly. Stimulating the right parts.
Brilliant. Dan, let's break down your one piece of advice on this topic, maybe into for two types of listeners. One, the recreational athlete, and two, the competitive / elite athlete. What would be Dr. Dan Plews' single piece of advice around HIIT training for each of those cohorts?
Single piece of advice. I think for both of them, I think HIIT training should be done all year round. But just, your changing of the types should change in accordance to the season. I'm not really a big fan of like periodized training where you don't touch any high intensity for the whole of the off season, and then suddenly you get to start racing and you have to do all this high intensity interval training. So I think that's a great piece of advice: is never neglect it, and never turn off that area of your physiology. That's my probably my biggest piece of advice for both elites and recreationals.
Yeah, that's brilliant. So never turn off part of your physiology by neglecting to do your high intensity interval training.
Yeah, exactly. It's just the amounts and the type that you do should change. So, you might do more closer to the season that is a bit harder, but you might do too close to the race season, whereas you might just be doing one short interval session or a sit interval early in the season, but never just totally neglect it and never ever do it as part of your program.
Brilliant. Dan, each week you output there from EndureIQ headquarters the weekly brew up, which is an email which I recommend everyone jump on the list for. Jump over to EndureIQ.com. I don't normally enjoy email in terms of communication. I think we all, in many ways, endure it, pardon the pun. But your brew up, or your team's brew up, is actually maybe one of the only emails I actually enjoy opening.
Oh, that's good.
It's brilliant. And each week you pop in there a workout of the week, and oftentimes an example might be a high-intensity interval training session.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, we try and keep it. We try and vary as much as we can. A bit of tempo, a bit of threshold, a bit of high intensity. We haven't done too many endurance sessions because go out and do a 2-hour ride at a low heart rate. But yeah, we try and keep it real.
So I definitely recommend everyone jumping over there to EndureIQ.com. And it's a fantastic resource. Plus, it keeps things interesting for some examples. But have you got one absolute favourite high-intensity interval session, Dan, that it's your go-to? It's what got you in shape for, obviously it's not one session alone, but got you in shape for your 824 in Hawaii in 2018?
Yeah, I mean, the interval session that I have done year in, year out, and I used to give, when I worked in Singapore, I worked in Singapore back before I moved to New Zealand, and I was working with the cycling team, and the session that I always used to give them was 8 by 4 minutes at around 103 to 105% of your threshold power with 2-minute recovery. And it's from a classic study that was done by Steptoe et al. And I think it was might be 1998, but it showed massive improvements in VO2 max. And I remember doing this on myself. Specifically, I did it week in, week out for almost a year. I never missed a session, and my cycling improved massively. And I think I started doing them all at 320 watts, and I finished doing them at 375. So increment just by, and I kept it constant, and I just increased the power all the way through. And yeah, I used to dread the session though. I think I've actually mentally scarred myself from doing it ever again. But it's my absolute favorite high intensity interval training. And the funny thing is on that, Brad, is that there's Stephen Seeley published some papers on great interval training sessions, and I think he showed that 8 by 4 minutes and 4 by 8 minutes are two really good sessions that you can do in terms of performance gains. And interestingly enough, they both add up to 32 minutes. So 32 minutes is the golden workload. Yeah.
Dr. Dan Plews, last time you appeared on episode 213, you issued listeners with a physical challenge for the week, which was a great one. It was to turn off the mobile phone for a day. So we can't break with tradition. We do need another Dr. Dan Plews physical challenge for the week.
Do you think anyone did it?
I think a lot of people thought about it.
Yeah. I know, it's so hard, isn't it? But I think this is an easy one, Brad, because as I've just given the ultimate interval session, everyone should go and try the ultimate interval session. So 8 by 4 minutes, 103 to 105% of your threshold with 2 minutes recovery.
Boom. And we must then tag you in on completion of this. So what's the best handle to tag you in on, Dan?
Instagram's probably the best handle, which is at the Plews. So you can find me on there. That would be the best one. I look forward to seeing everyone getting involved in that. It's a real doozy. You can do it too, I'm sure.
I'll commit to getting that one completed and mark it as done, Dan.
Yeah, nice. Love it.
Dr. Dan Plews, you're a wealth of information and knowledge, and not just academic knowledge, translated knowledge, which I think is why so many people enjoy hearing from you. So no doubt we'd like to welcome you back on another topic on an expert edition in the coming time. So, but for today, thank you for your contribution and enlightening us around this topic of high-intensity interval training for endurance athletes.
No, thank you very much. And I should probably mention that. So, as part of the high-intensity interval training book, me and Professor Paul Lawson, we also produced a course as well that's on the high intensity interval training. So he's got a whole course in the whole area. Me and him did the triathlon course together just on high intensity interval training. And then I also did with Anna Holt the course on rowing as well for high intensity interval training. So that's probably worth people checking out as well. I should have mentioned that earlier.
And is that a module on the EndureIQ website, or that's separate?
So it's separate, yeah. So if you just Google HIIT Science, you'll be able to find those courses. We have, so as part of LDT 102 on EndureIQ, which is more like training fundamentals, there's a whole module on high intensity interval training for triathletes. But that's more building it into the entire training plan. So it's one module, because within that course we have high intensity interval training periodization, training volume, training polarized training, lots of different topics. And one of those modules is on high intensity interval training. But the HIIT Science module is just only specifically high intensity interval training. So yeah, you can check all those things out and see which one floats your boat, I guess.
Yeah, we'll link them up in the show notes. And once again, Dr. Dan, all the best for what hopefully is a smoother 2021.
Yeah, thanks very much, Brad. Great to be on again.
So there you have it, another episode of the Physical Performance Show. And I know, just like last time, episode 213, you've thoroughly enjoyed Dan Plews' sharings once again. Now be sure to jump over and follow Dan on social at The Plews. And whatever you do, make sure you subscribe to EndureIQ's The Brew Up. It's their weekly newsletter. It is not spam. It's an email that I actually look forward to receiving each week. And in that, Dan shares what he's reading, learning, new technologies, new science in a simple and digestible format. So be sure to jump over to EndureIQ and sign up for the weekly Brew Up. You won't be disappointed. We'll link all resources up to our show notes over at pogophysio.com.au. And as always, keep the podsies coming. That's a screenshot of the episode you're enjoying at any given moment, tagging in the show on social at Physical Performance Show. You'll find us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And of course, now also over on YouTube. A massive thanks, as always, to the great folk who make this show possible. Daryl Misson, our audio engineer, Susan Wilkin on all things show administration, and Matthew Olding on all things show graphic design. Don't forget, if you'd like to support the production of the show, you can do so from just $5 per month and become a Learnings member. It's simple. Jump over to Patreon, Patreon, and there you can pledge your support. As we always say, podcasts are free to download. However, they are not free to produce, so any support goes a long way. In return, we'll grant you access, as prior mentioned, to our back catalogue and all forthcoming planned live stream events. Fantastic learning opportunities that serve the mission of the show, and that is to help you discover your physical best performance. Now, coming up on next week's episode of the Physical Performance Show, we jump over to a featured performer. And next week's guest has been in the pipeline for circa 3 to 4 years. It is Emma Carney, dual world triathlon champion, the most dominant female triathlete for a 5-year period from 1994 to 1999 on the planet, and author of recently released autobiography, Hardwired, Life, Death, and Triathlon. It's a featured performer episode you are not going to want to miss, as Emma Carney shares on her career highs, lows, and many learnings. And by gosh, there has been a lot of all three of those for Emma Carney. So until next week, keep pursuing your physical best performance. I'm Brad Beer, and this has been the Physical Performance Show.